48 minutes. That is how long Dr. Whitfield had before a Navy SEAL's life would depend on the woman he was systematically trying to destroy. Danielle Ross did not know this yet. She was checking a patient's for line in Trauma Bay 3, her movements precise as a surgeon's despite working in an environment that still felt fundamentally wrong, all fluorescent hum and antiseptic sharpness, nothing like the field stations in Fallujah where decisions were made on instinct and adrenaline. Riverside Community Hospital in Jacksonville ran on protocols, on hierarchy, on the assumption that the man with the title knew what he was doing. The floor dripped steadily. Clear fluid, running at 125 milliliters per hour. Danielle adjusted the rate without being asked, her fingers steady despite the familiar ghost ache in her left hand where shrapnel had left its calling card. She had rebuilt enough of a civilian life over the past 18 months to know how to be invisible, how to move through the corridors with quiet efficiency, present but not remarkable, helpful but not threatening. The ER nurses called her for second opinions on medication interactions. They asked her to double-check doctor's orders. They whispered her name like she was a secret they were allowed to keep. Dr. Whitfield hated that. She felt his presence before she heard him, that particular weight of observation that meant trouble. Danielle finished documenting the for adjustment, her handwriting precise and small, and turned from the patient. Whitfield stood at the nurse's station, his tie perfectly knotted, his shoes polished to an expensive shine, his face arranged in an expression that suggested he had just swallowed something bitter. At 43, Dr. Whitfield had the kind of mediocre competence that only feels safe when no one smarter is in the room. For 18 months, no one smarter had been. Until Danielle had arrived looking for a position where nobody would ask questions about a medical discharge from the Navy. 3 of his misdiagnoses had been corrected before they reached the patient. That was the real problem. Not that the diagnoses were wrong, physicians made mistakes, the ER forgave mistakes, but that a staff nurse had caught them. Caught them quietly. Efficiently. Without drama or fanfare, just a gentle suggestion that perhaps the patient's presentation was consistent with something else, wasn't it, doctor? And each time, his face had gone a particular shade of red that told her he understood exactly what was happening. His authority was being negotiated downward in real time, observed by interns and residents and the kind of nursing staff that talked. Danielle moved toward the medication station, intending to restock the empty boxes of gauze pads. The elevator doors at the far end of the corridor were closing when Whitfield's voice cut across the ER like a scalpel. Ross. She did not look back immediately. There was power in making him wait one breath. 2. Then she turned, her expression neutral in the way that only people who had trained for combat could maintain, a face that revealed nothing, a face that made other people very uncomfortable. Doctor. He was standing near the elevator. Waiting. His hand was raised, holding the doors open. It was not a request. Danielle moved toward him, her scrubs whispering against her skin, the sound like wind through a broken window. She had learned in Fallujah that confrontation happened in small, contained spaces. Elevators. Hallways. Vehicles. Places where other people were forced to witness but could do nothing about it. The doors closed behind her. Whitfield's hand remained pressed against the button for the 3rd floor, but they were not rising. His body filled the elevator with the kind of territorial presence that belonged to a man who had never had his authority questioned until now. Across from him, 2 interns stared at their phones with the focused intensity of people trying to become invisible. They failed. I want to be clear about something, Whitfield said, his voice dropping into a register that only the 4 of them could hear. Former military types often struggle with the collaborative nature of civilian medicine. The elevator smelled of industrial cleaner and someone's expensive cologne. Danielle's hands hung at her sides, relaxed, every muscle beneath her skin in perfect stillness. This was a learned response. In Fallujah, she had held this exact composure while rounds fired overhead. While teammates bled out. While the world split open and demanded that she choose between falling apart and getting it done. They come in thinking they know better, Whitfield continued, his body angling slightly to block the elevator doors from opening. thinking their experience in a combat zone somehow translates to an American hospital. But it doesn't work that way here. We follow procedure. We follow chain of command. We collaborate. 15 seconds had passed. The interns were not looking at anything anymore. They were simply waiting for this to end. Understood, Danielle said. Her voice was quiet, almost apologetic. It was the voice of a woman rebuilding a life, not the voice that had ordered a trauma team to move faster, to think sharper, to trust her judgment because the alternative was a body bag. This voice was smaller. Acceptable. I apologize if I've overstepped. Whitfield's jaw loosened. He had been expecting resistance, or tears, or the kind of defensive anger that would justify his narrative about unstable former military personnel. Instead, he received contrition. A lowering of eyes. The body language of submission. He let his hand drop from the door button. The elevator rose toward the 3rd floor, and Danielle's composure remained absolute, her face smooth as still water. The shift continued for another 4 hours. Danielle moved through the ER with even greater invisibility than before, checking on patients, restocking supplies, staying clear of Whitfield's line of sight. By the time her shift ended at 1800 hours, the confrontation had already calcified into the kind of incident that people would retell as gossip rather than harassment. Did you hear what Whitfield said to Ross about military types? He was so weird about it. She collected her belongings from her locker on the 3rd floor, opening the narrow metal door with her key. Her scrubs hung inside, neatly folded. A spare stethoscope. A pen. And tucked behind everything else, hidden where only she knew to look, the pair of worn combat boots. That was when she saw it. The note was taped to the inside of the locker door, a single piece of white paper folded once, written in block letters with a marker that smelled of chemicals. She read it without removing it from the tape. G.I. Jane needs to learn her place. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song. Somewhere down the hallway, a code was being called. Another trauma incoming. The hospital continued its essential work around her while Danielle stared at the note with the same expressionless calm she had maintained in the elevator. Her pulse did not accelerate. Her hands did not tremble. The trembling was not fear. The trembling was restraint, and she had learned 18 months ago how to keep it contained inside her own skin where no one could see it. She did not remove the note. She closed the locker door instead and turned her key in the lock, securing whatever was inside, both the boots and the insult and the message that she would never quite belong here no matter how competent she proved herself to be. The parking lot was hot. August in Jacksonville meant the asphalt had absorbed the sun's rage and held it in reserve, radiating it upward in waves that made the air shimmer. Danielle moved toward her car, a 2014 Honda Civic, practical and forgettable, and slid into the driver's seat. She did not start the engine. Instead, she sat with her hands on the steering wheel and her eyes fixed on the trunk, though she could not see inside it from where she was sitting. The combat boots were in there. She had placed them there 18 months ago when she'd accepted this position, when she had decided that some parts of herself would need to stay in storage while she learned how to be ordinary. The boots were tan leather, worn soft by dust and blood and the particular geography of a desert where decisions mattered and silence meant survival. She had worn them through 3 tours. She had worn them through field medicine in conditions that would have made most civilian physicians weep. She had worn them the day Commander Price had court-martialed her after Fallujah. 20 minutes passed. 20 minutes of Danielle Ross sitting in a car in a hospital parking lot, staring straight ahead at nothing, her hands gripping the steering wheel like it might try to escape. The air conditioning was off. Sweat collected on her temples. A family walked past, heading toward the ER entrance with the grim determination of people about to spend 8 hours in a waiting room. An ambulance screamed into the bay behind her, its sirens cutting through the afternoon like something wounded. She thought about her old team. She thought about the names she could not say out loud because they were classified. She thought about the woman she had been in Fallujah, the one who had not needed permission to do what was right, who had never questioned her own authority, who had been called Reaper 6 and meant it as a compliment. Then she started the engine and drove home. The staff meeting began at 0700 sharp. Dr. Whitfield stood at the head of the conference room table, arms crossed, his tailored shirt pressed to a knife edge. 17 staff members occupied the folding chairs: nurses, residents, medical students, respiratory therapists. Danielle sat in the back row, clipboard in her lap, saying nothing. She had learned to take up minimal space. Whitfield scanned the room with the practiced gaze of someone accustomed to deference. His eyes landed on Danielle and held. "Nurse Ross," he said, voice dripping false curiosity. "Let's discuss some pharmacology, shall we? For the benefit of the entire team." No one moved. The fluorescent panels above cast everything in clinical white, and the silence stretched like a rubber band pulled too tight. "Can you explain the contraindications between vasopressin and beta blockers in septic shock?" His tone made it clear this was not a question. Danielle's face remained utterly blank. 19 years of military service had taught her how to compartmentalize everything: thought, feeling, fear, into separate rooms inside her mind. She locked the doors and spoke. "Vasopressin can potentiate coronary vasoconstriction when combined with non-selective beta blockers. Increases myocardial infarction risk significantly. Requires dose adjustment or alternative therapy." Her voice was steady, flat, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. The room shifted. Someone's pen clicked. Whitfield's smile tightened at the corners like a knot being pulled. He leaned forward slightly, as if her answer had offended him personally. "And the interaction between linezolid and SSRIs?" "Serotonin syndrome," Danielle said immediately. "Elevated serotonin levels, hyperreflexia, muscle rigidity. Requires 24-hour washout period and cardiac monitoring." She did not blink. Her hands remained folded on the clipboard. He fired 6 more questions in rapid succession. Ciprofloxacin and theophylline. Methotrexate and NSAIDs. Warfarin and cranberry extract. Doxorubicin and trastuzumab. Each one more obscure than the last, the kind of questions that belonged in a pharmacology exam, not a morning staff meeting. And each one she answered without hesitation, without consulting her notes, without anything but the flat recitation of facts delivered like someone reading a menu at a drive-through window. The staff watched. A resident's jaw tightened. A respiratory therapist exchanged a glance with the unit secretary. This was not what was supposed to happen. Nurses answered questions from doctors. Nurses deferred. Nurses admitted when they did not know. Nurses certainly did not answer obscure pharmacology questions with the precision of someone who had studied for the Navy Medical Corps entrance exams and then conducted field medicine in Fallujah with only a ruck and a prayer and hands that learned to make decisions before her brain caught up. Whitfield's face had gone the particular shade of red that comes from a man watching his power being questioned in front of an audience. He stood abruptly, scraping his chair back against the tile floor with a sound like a knife being drawn. "Well," he said, his voice clipped and precise now, the false curiosity burned away entirely. "It seems we have a collaborative learning opportunity. Effective immediately, all of Nurse Ross's patients are being reassigned to other staff for mentoring purposes. More experienced guidance. Team building." He did not look at Danielle when he said it. He looked at the other nurses. "This is about fostering the kind of teamwork that keeps our department functioning smoothly. Some people," and here his gaze did flick toward her, "struggle with the collaborative nature of civilian medicine. They're accustomed to working in different contexts, where orders are followed without question. That doesn't work here." The message was clear. In this hospital, in this room, in front of everyone, he was reasserting dominance. The reassignment was punishment disguised as pedagogy. Danielle would spend the day shadowing less experienced nurses, watching her own work get dismantled by people half her competence, and there was nothing she could do about it because she was just a nurse, and he was the director, and the board had his back, and the system was designed to protect men like him. She stood without being dismissed and walked out. No one stopped her. The elevator came at 1400. Danielle had spent the morning watching a nurse named Trevor, who had been at Riverside for 6 months and once nearly administered heparin to a patient with a documented allergy. She had corrected him silently, moved his hand, and walked away. Her jaw had not unclenched in 4 hours. The elevator doors were closing when Whitfield's hand shot forward, stopping them. He stepped inside deliberately, positioning himself directly in front of her, his body filling the space between her and the exit like a cork in a bottle. 2 interns stood in the back corner staring at their shoes so intently they seemed to be taking inventory of the scuff marks on the tile. "You know, G.I. Jane," Whitfield said softly, his voice almost conversational now, which somehow made it worse than shouting, "some people can't handle civilian teamwork. They need structure. Hierarchy. They need to be told what to do and how to do it. They get confused in environments that require actual collaboration." He was close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and aggressive. "That kind of thing doesn't work in a modern hospital. We need nurses who understand their place. Who respect the chain of command. Who don't think they know better than their physicians." His body blocked the exit. 15 seconds passed. 20. The interns did not look up. Danielle stared forward, through him, at the brushed metal elevator wall on the other side. She did not let her breathing change. She did not clench her fists. She did not acknowledge him the way he wanted to be acknowledged, with anger, or fear, or defensiveness. She gave him nothing but the same flat, empty composure she wore like armor. When the doors finally opened on the 3rd floor, she stepped out without looking at him. He remained in the elevator, his face flushed, watching her disappear down the corridor. The doors slid shut. She opened her locker at 1847. A note had been taped to the inside of the metal door, folded once, white paper against the industrial gray. She read it with the same expressionless calm she had maintained all day. G.I. Jane needs to learn her place. She folded the note once, then again, and placed it in her scrub pocket. No trembling. No hot flush of humiliation. Just the mechanical action of someone filing information for later processing. She changed out of her uniform and walked to her car in silence. The parking lot was nearly empty. 5:38 p.m. on a Tuesday in Jacksonville, and the city sprawled out beyond the hospital perimeter under a sky that had turned the color of old pennies. She sat in the driver's seat with her hands on the steering wheel and stared at nothing for 20 minutes. 21 minutes, to be precise. She counted them. In the trunk, wrapped in a canvas bag beneath the spare tire, were a pair of combat boots. Worn through. Laces tied in a specific knot she had been taught by Senior Chief Marcus Webb during Hell Week in San Diego in 2002. The leather was cracked from sand and blood and rain and the particular kind of degradation that comes from walking through Fallujah with 30 pounds of gear while rounds snapped past your head like angry wasps. She had not unpacked them in the 17 months since her medical discharge. They represented a life that no longer existed, a rank she could no longer claim, a team that had moved on without her, and a woman named Reaper 6 who had made decisions in the dark that had consequences stretching into futures she could not control. She thought about that woman now. The one who had not needed permission to do what was right. The one who had never questioned her own authority. The one who had run toward the sound of gunfire while other people ran away. Then she started the engine and drove home. The radio crackled at 3:05 the next morning. Danielle was already at the hospital, already in her scrubs, already moving through the pre-dawn darkness of the ER with the particular kind of purpose that comes from having somewhere to be and someone counting on you. Training accident, the dispatch said. Navy SEAL, severe lower extremity trauma, ETA 5 minutes. She did not hesitate. She moved to Trauma Bay 3 and began pulling supplies with the muscle memory of someone who had done this before, in sand and heat and the particular screaming silence of a combat hospital where every second was its own kind of clock. 20-gauge 4 lines. 2-liter bags of lactated ringers. The defibrillator, the monitor, the suction tubing that hissed like something alive. Pressure bandages. A fasciotomy kit in the corner, instruments laid out with surgical precision, the blade, the retractors, the clamps, all arranged the way her hands remembered. She had not thought about that kit in 17 months. Her hands knew exactly where everything belonged. The ambulance bay doors burst open with the sound of thunder and purpose. Paramedics wheeled in a stretcher at a run. A SEAL in full tactical gear, wet combat boots still laced, his legs partially wrapped in battle dressings that were already saturated through. His face was grey with pain. His breathing had gone shallow and fast. But his eyes were awake, conscious, and when they found Danielle's, recognition flashed across his features like lightning. Commander Price. The same officer who had sat across from her in the JG office in 2006 and called her reckless. Who had said her decisions had compromised the entire team. Who had stripped her of her rank reduction to petty officer second class and given her a discharge marked medical but expedited in a file she was not allowed to read. Who had broken her career with a few words in a room and then walked away. "You," he rasped, his voice thin and shaking. "Get me someone else." Dr. Whitfield pushed forward, his movements sharp and authoritative, asserting control like a man who had spent his career perfecting the appearance of competence. "Let's get vitals, start fluids, page vascular surgery." His voice had the particular confidence of someone who had never had to make a decision under fire, who had never had to choose between amputation and death in real time, who believed protocol solved everything because he had never been anywhere that protocol was meaningless. Danielle's gaze stayed on Price's leg. The tissue beneath the torn fatigues had swollen grotesquely, stretched tight and dark, the kind of swelling that came from pressure building inside the compartment, the one bounded by unyielding fascia, the one that could only be relieved by opening the skin and letting the pressure out before the blood vessels collapsed entirely and the tissue started dying. She had maybe an hour. Maybe less. "Doctor," Danielle said quietly, her voice the same flat register she had used in the staff meeting. "That's compartment syndrome. Pressure's building. He has maybe 30 minutes before we lose the leg." She was already measuring the leg circumference with a tape, checking the distal pulses, watching them weaken under her fingers like a heartbeat running out of energy. Whitfield barely glanced at her. "We'll wait for the specialist." "That's protocol." His attention was on Price's vitals, on the monitors, on the performance of being a doctor rather than the actual medicine of keeping a man alive. 28 minutes on the clock. Price's breathing had become labored, his vitals starting to destabilize, his blood pressure dropping as the compartment pressure rose and rose and rose, crushing the blood vessels, cutting off the oxygen, beginning the particular violence of tissue death that came not from bullets but from the body's own betrayal. Danielle's hands moved. They prepared a fasciotomy kit in the corner, laying out instruments with the mechanical precision of someone whose muscle memory had been trained by necessity. The blade. The retractors. The clamps. Everything arranged exactly as it needed to be. Everything ready for what came next. Whitfield noticed. "What do you think you're doing?" His voice had gone sharp and suspicious, the way it always did when he felt his authority being questioned. "Being ready," Danielle said simply. The radio crackled at 0543. "Training accident. SEAL team exercises gone wrong. Severe lower extremity trauma inbound to Riverside Community. ETA 8 minutes. Danielle heard it from the break room, heard the dispatcher's voice flatten into that particular cadence reserved for life-threatening cases, and she was moving before the announcement finished. Coffee cup abandoned on the counter. Badge already clipped. Her body knew the rhythm. This was not a drill, not a routine shift. This was the sound of someone bleeding out in the back of an ambulance, and time had already begun its countdown. The ER mobilized like a single organism responding to stimulus. Charge nurse coordinating bed assignments. Respiratory text checking equipment. 2 nurses drawing blood for type and cross. Danielle moved through it all with mechanical precision, her footsteps echoing across linoleum as she pushed into Trauma Bay 3, the largest suite, the one reserved for cases that demanded everything. Her hands knew what to do without waiting for her brain to catch up. 16-gauge needle. 2 large-bore 4 lines. Saline hanging. She laid out the instruments in sequence: forceps, hemostats, retractors, suction tips, each tool in its precise place on the Mayo stand. Trauma shears. Gauze pads. The crash cart positioned within arm's reach. Everything arranged so that in the chaos of resuscitation, no one would waste a single second searching. Dr. Whitfield appeared in the doorway, his white coat still immaculate at this hour, his expression already carrying that edge of irritation that came from being summoned to the ER before dawn. He watched Danielle work without speaking, his jaw tightening as he observed the efficiency of her preparation, the way she moved like someone who had done this not dozens of times but hundreds. She felt his eyes on her as she checked the defibrillator pads, as she verified the oxygen was running at full flow, as she positioned the stretcher to allow maximum access from all sides. Severe compartment syndrome, Danielle said quietly, still working, still laying out supplies. Likely crush injury. We'll need to prep for. We'll assess when the patient arrives. Whitfield cut her off, his voice carrying that particular edge of authority that made clear he had not asked for her professional opinion. I don't need you narrating treatment protocols. We have a vascular surgeon being called in. Danielle didn't respond. She continued checking the 4 pumps, testing the monitor leads, moving with the kind of calm that came from having already accepted what was coming. The vascular surgeon was still at home. Still getting dressed. Still 45 minutes away in pre-dawn traffic. The ambulance bay doors burst open with the sound of wheels and urgent voices. The paramedics brought him in fast, calling out vitals in that rapid-fire staccato: crush injury to lower left extremity, 2-hour extrication, compartment syndrome suspected, O2 sat 91 on high flow, heart rate 120, blood pressure 104/62 and dropping. The stretcher wheeled into trauma bay 3, and Danielle looked at the patient's face for the first time. The world tilted. Commander Price. Not a memory. Not a photograph from a personnel file. The actual man, conscious but pale, his uniform torn away from the waist down, his left leg mottled purple and swollen to nearly twice the size of the right. His eyes were still sharp despite the pain, still carrying that weight of command, still carrying the weight of decisions made in the heat of Fallujah that had ended Danielle's career in a single afternoon. Her hands went cold. Every muscle in her body locked for exactly 1 second, the only moment she would allow herself. Then she moved. Monitors. For access. Already in place from the paramedics, but she verified, rechecked, because protocol demanded it and because she couldn't look at his face and maintain any other thoughts simultaneously. How long? She asked the paramedics, her voice steady, which was the only miracle that mattered. 2 hours trapped, one of them said. Leg's been under pressure the whole time. When we got him out, the color was already questionable. Danielle looked at the leg. The deep purple, almost black color of tissue being slowly suffocated, the swelling that pushed against the skin like something trying to escape from the inside. Compartment syndrome. The pressure building inside the fascial compartments, compressing blood vessels, strangling the muscle and nerve tissue, making each passing minute more irreversible than the last. We have 30 minutes, she said to Whitfield, her voice low and factual. 40 at absolute maximum. After that, even if we save the limb, we lose the function. He'll need a fasciotomy now. Not in 40 minutes. Now. Whitfield was already moving to Price's bedside, his hands performing their practiced assessment, checking pulses that were already becoming thready, assessing sensation that was already fading. Vascular surgery is being called, he said, not looking up. We'll wait for the surgeon. That's how this is done. The surgeon is 45 minutes out, Danielle said. She kept her voice level, kept her hand steady as she pushed fluids through the 4 line, as she adjusted oxygen flow, as she did everything except what her body was screaming to do. We have 30 minutes before the tissue becomes unrecoverable. The math doesn't work. I'm aware of the timeline, Whitfield said sharply. His eyes finally met hers, and in that gaze was every confrontation from the elevator, every reassignment, every moment of deliberate humiliation. What I'm not aware of is you suddenly becoming a surgeon. We wait for the appropriate specialist. That's final. Danielle stepped back. Her jaw clenched, the only visible reaction, but she stepped back, because arguing would only waste more of the 30 minutes, and because she had learned long ago that sometimes the only power you had was the power to prepare for the moment everyone else was still refusing to acknowledge. She moved to the kit. The fasciotomy kit. The instruments for performing an emergency surgical decompression of the leg, for making the long deep incisions through skin and fascia that would release the pressure, that would give the tissue a chance, that would save the limb if done in the next 28 minutes, and that would be career suicide if performed without authorization. She laid out the scalpel, the retractors, the electrocautery device. She arranged them with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory, from hands that had held these instruments in sandstorms while rounds snapped overhead, from a time when decisions about amputation had been made in seconds rather than committee meetings. The instruments gleamed under the bay lights, waiting. Price's vitals began their slow descent. 102/58. Heart rate climbing. Respiration shallow. The body's panic response to pain, to the knowledge on some cellular level that the tissue was dying, that time was being murdered 1 second at a time. Danielle stood at the foot of the bed and watched the monitor. Watched the numbers. Watched the clock on the wall reading 0551. 20 minutes gone. 20 left. Maybe. Doctor, she said quietly, we're out of time. I said we wait, Whitfield replied, his voice taking on that particular quality of desperation that came from being in a position where he was simultaneously certain he was right and terrified he was wrong. The clock ticked. 0552, 19 minutes. Price's eyes rolled back. His body went rigid. The seizure came like a thunderstorm, violent and sudden, the bed rails shaking under him, the monitors screaming their alarms into the silence. Muscle contractions from hypoxia, from the brain recognizing that the tissue below the waist was dying and the body's survival instinct responding with pure electrical chaos. His heart rate spiked to 142. Blood pressure crashing. The entire ER seemed to hold its breath, everyone frozen, everyone watching Dr. Whitfield for a command that didn't come because Whitfield himself was frozen, staring at the monitors as if they might somehow reset if he looked hard enough. 3 seconds of silence. That was all it took. 3 seconds of no decision, and Danielle made the only decision that mattered. She reached for the scalpel. The blade caught the fluorescent light as she moved, and in that moment Whitfield's voice erupted, "Stop! Do not!" But she was already moving. The scalpel made the first incision, long and deep, from the lateral knee down toward the ankle, cutting through skin and superficial fascia with the kind of confidence that came from having done this in field hospitals with nothing but a headlamp and the knowledge that every second of hesitation cost a soldier the use of their leg. Blood welled up, and she was already using the retractors, spreading the fascia apart, releasing the pressure that had been building for nearly 45 minutes. The tissue color began to change almost immediately. The deep purple lightening. The swelling starting to reduce as the pressure released. Her hands moved with mechanical precision. She was aware of Whitfield shouting, aware of nurses standing frozen, aware of the entire ER watching a single moment of decision unfold, but her hands were elsewhere, in a different country, in a different war, where compartment syndrome and crush injuries were treated with the same calm efficiency because the alternative was a career Marine losing a limb. 8 minutes. That was all it took to save what vascular surgery would have spent 3 hours trying to salvage. 8 minutes of controlled, precise incisions, of releasing the fascial compartments, of allowing the tissue to breathe again. By the time she was finished, Price's vitals had stabilized. His heart rate dropping from 142 to 96. His blood pressure rising back to measurable levels. His color returning to something approaching human. The monitor beeped steady. Normal sinus rhythm. The leg saved. The function preserved. Everything the training and expertise of 2 decades had prepared her to accomplish, now accomplished, now done, now utterly unforgivable. The room went dead silent. Not the silence of relief or success. The silence of a boundary crossed. Of hierarchy violated. Of a nurse performing surgery in a hospital where hierarchy and protocol and the deference to physicians was supposed to be unquestioned. Whitfield's face had gone white. Then red. His hands were shaking, actually shaking, with the kind of rage that came from having been humiliated not just in front of staff but in front of a Navy SEAL, in front of someone whose opinion of him now carried the weight of military authority. "You just ended your career," he said quietly. His voice was steady now, controlled, carrying something far more dangerous than anger. Something like certainty. "Get out of my trauma bay." Danielle set down the scalpel. She was aware that her hands were steady. She was aware that her breathing was controlled. She was aware that she had just made a choice that would cost her everything, and that the choice had been inevitable from the moment she recognized Commander Price's face. She stepped back from the bed. She removed her gloves. She waited for the moment when she would crumble, when the weight of what she had done would finally break through the composure that had carried her through 2 wars and 1 civilian life barely held together, and it did not come. "I need some jello," she said quietly, and watched the ghost of something, recognition, maybe, or understanding, flicker across Price's face before she turned and walked out of the trauma bay, knowing already that nothing would ever be the same. At minute 25, Commander Price's body went rigid. His back arched off the stretcher like someone had run 10,000 volts through his spine. The monitor shrieked. His eyes rolled back, white showing, and the seizure took him, arms thrashing, legs convulsing, the entire trauma bay erupting into controlled chaos. Nurses moved to protect his airway. A resident reached for sedation. Dr. Whitfield's voice boomed across the room, "Get me 5 of my Dazalam, someone get me," and Danielle moved. Not toward the medication. Toward the tray. Her hands were already pulling on fresh gloves, the snap of latex against her wrists precise as a rifle bolt. She didn't ask permission. She didn't hesitate. She reached for the 14-gauge angiocath needle and the scalpel from the fasciotomy kit, her movements carrying the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd performed field amputations in sandstorms while mortars fell around her. The room went still. Every eye turned to her. Whitfield's face went the color of old concrete. "Ross, what in God's name are you?" She was already prepping the skin, her hands moving on their own, muscle memory taking over like a second heartbeat. 26 minutes. 27. Price's oxygen saturation was dropping, 68, now 65, the numbers falling like a countdown to amputation. The leg was dying. The tissue was already turning dark, the compartment pressure crushing everything inside, and in maybe 4 more minutes his body would decide whether to keep the limb or keep his life. She made the first incision without waiting for authorization. The scalpel bit deep through skin and fascia, and Whitfield's voice reached a pitch that sounded almost inhuman. "Stop. Stop that immediately. You are not authorized," but the hiss of air escaping the compartment was louder than his screaming. Pressure released. Danielle's hands moved through the procedure like they'd never left, checking the muscles beneath, confirming tissue viability, watching for the pink of healthy flesh instead of the necrotic black of death. 2 minutes. 3. The monitor showed Price's body finally relaxing out of seizure as the pressure dropped, as oxygen finally reached starved tissue. Her breathing was steady. Her jaw was set. There was no tremor in her fingers, no doubt, no hesitation, just the mechanical precision of a senior enlisted combat medic who'd saved lives under fire in places where there was no backup, no lawyers, no ethics boards. Just patience and the clock. 8 minutes. She set down the instruments and stepped back. Price's leg was saved. The tissue was viable. The compartment was decompressed. Sinus rhythm returned to the monitor, steady, strong, the rhythm of a man who would walk again. The entire ER held its breath. Whitfield's face went white, then red, the color spreading up his neck like someone was inflating him from the inside. His hands were shaking. Not from fear. From rage. From the terrible understanding that every person in that room had just watched a nurse perform surgery better than he ever could, and there was nothing in the rulebook that let him unsee it. He turned and walked out of the trauma bay without a word. Danielle pulled off her gloves and disposed of them in the biohazard container. She didn't watch him go. She checked Price's vitals one more time, stable, all of it stable, and then she stepped back and let the nurses take over, the way she always did, the way she'd learned to disappear. But the damage was already done. Within the hour, Dr. Whitfield made 3 phone calls. The first was to the hospital board chair, a man who'd hired Whitfield 15 years ago and still owed him favors from a malpractice settlement Whitfield had covered for. The second was to the VA hospital in Jacksonville where Danielle had listed a professional reference. The third was to the state medical board. In that call, his voice was measured, professional, the voice of a concerned physician. "I need to file an urgent investigation. One of my nurses performed unauthorized surgical procedures on a patient without medical authorization. I'm concerned about her stability and her qualifications. She may be a danger to patient safety." By 2 o'clock that afternoon, 2 security guards appeared in the ER. They weren't rude. They weren't aggressive. They were just there, professional and unmovable, waiting by the entrance like they had all the time in the world. Danielle saw them and understood immediately. She didn't run. She didn't argue. She simply finished her charting, logged out of the computer, and walked toward them with the same empty expression she'd worn through 6 months of Whitfield's humiliation, the same flat effect that had made her invisible through the insults, through the elevator entrapment, through the note in her locker. Whitfield's voice followed her down the hallway, loud enough that everyone could hear. "Unauthorized procedures. Dangerous cowboys who don't respect protocol. This is exactly what I was worried about." He said it like he was vindicated. Like he'd won. Danielle kept walking. The security guard on her left held the door. The afternoon sun hit her face and she blinked once, slowly, the way someone blinks when waking from a long sleep. She surrendered her badge at the security desk, the plastic rectangle with her photo, her name, her credentials, all of it going into a manila envelope. The badge felt light. Nothing felt heavy anymore. She signed the paperwork releasing her from duty, effective immediately, pending investigation. Pending review. Pending decisions made by people who would never know what 30 minutes of compartment syndrome felt like, what 8 minutes of knowing you might not make it felt like, what the weight of keeping someone alive when every second mattered felt like. She drove home in silence. The radio stayed off. Her phone stayed silent. She didn't check messages. She pulled into her driveway at 2:24 p.m. and sat in the driver's seat for 4 minutes, just breathing, just existing in the space between one life and another. Then she went to the trunk and pulled out the pair of worn combat boots. They were the ones she'd kept, the ones that had touched every dust storm and every piece of ground in Fallujah where she'd knelt beside dying men with their blood on her hands and their names on her lips. The leather was cracked. The laces were frayed. They smelled like sand and cordage and something else, something like memory. She set them on the living room floor and stared at them for an hour. Not moving. Not thinking. Just staring at the physical remnant of a life where her hands had mattered, where decisions had mattered, where saving someone was the only thing that mattered. The next morning, official letters arrived in the mail. State Medical Board investigation opened. Hospital privileges suspended pending review. Character references being contacted. Dr. Whitfield had activated his network, board members who owed him favors, colleagues who wouldn't dare stand against him, a system designed to protect doctors from nurses who knew too much. By day 2, the board investigator came to Riverside to interview staff. Some defended her. She saved his leg, one nurse said flatly. Without her, he'd have lost it. But others hesitated when the investigator pressed. Mentioned protocol violations. Mentioned unauthorized procedures. Mentioned that Dr. Whitfield was very concerned about patient safety. Whitfield provided written testimony, his words precise and poisoned. Nurse Ross exhibits dangerous impulsivity consistent with untreated combat trauma. She defied direct orders and performed emergency surgery without proper qualification or authorization. I have serious concerns about her stability and her fitness for duty. I feared for my other patients' safety. Day 3. Danielle sat in the waiting room of the Jacksonville VA hospital, surrounded by young veterans with fresh injuries, men and women she'd treated in the field, soldiers and Marines with bandaged limbs and haunted eyes. None of them recognized the hollow-eyed woman in civilian clothes sitting 3 rows back, filling out intake forms. She used to be Senior Chief Petty Officer Ross. Now she was just a name on a form, another veteran waiting for a psychiatric evaluation, the final requirement before her medical discharge became permanent, before she officially ceased to exist as anything other than a civilian. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like they were counting down the seconds until something changed. But she couldn't know, that at Riverside Community Hospital, Commander Price had regained consciousness 2 hours ago, had felt the sensation returning to his leg, had understood exactly who had saved him and exactly what had happened when his eyes rolled back and the seizure took him. She didn't know that he was already making phone calls. She didn't know that the next 72 hours would erase everything Whitfield had done. 3 days. That's how long Danielle had been sitting in waiting rooms, fluorescent light casting her skin the color of old bone, surrounded by young veterans with fresh wounds she recognized in her sleep. The VA hospital in Jacksonville smelled like every VA hospital on the continent, antiseptic and failure and the particular brand of governmental indifference that came in bottles labeled procedure. She'd surrendered her badge on a Thursday. By Saturday she was here, waiting for a psychiatric evaluation that would make her discharge permanent, waiting for someone in a white coat to confirm what she already knew, that she was broken beyond repair. The file folder on the intake nurse's desk read Ross, D. No first name. No rank. Just initials and a last name, as if the woman sitting in the plastic chair with a 2-week-old coffee stain on her scrubs was just another broken vet cycling through the system. Around her, Marines with missing fingers scrolled through their phones. A kid who couldn't have been more than 19 sat with one leg extended, the prosthetic socket visible where his jeans ended. A woman with her arm in a sling stared at the wall like it had answers. Nobody recognized her. Of course they didn't. She'd spent 30 years learning to be invisible. The intercom crackled. Senior Chief Ross? Evaluation Room 3. She didn't move. The clock on the wall read 05:07. 13 minutes until her appointment. 13 minutes until a psychiatrist who'd never fired a weapon, never held a bleeding teammate, never made a decision that cost lives decided whether she was fit to walk free society or whether she needed a 72-hour hold. She closed her eyes and felt the phantom weight of the combat boot still sitting in her trunk, the only evidence that Reaper 6 had ever existed at all. That's when the windows rattled. Not from wind. From rotors. Heavy rotors, the kind that made car alarms shriek in parking lots and set off the survival instinct in every combat veteran's nervous system at once. Danielle's eye snapped open. Around her, the young Marine stiffened. The kid with the prosthetic sat up straight. The woman with the sling stopped staring at nothing. A UH-60M Black Hawk descended into the parking lot with the precision of a surgeon's hands, nose pitched slightly forward, landing lights strobing across the waiting room windows like a heartbeat. The rotor wash shook the glass hard enough that the intake nurse looked up from her desk, startled. No one landed military helicopters at civilian VA hospitals. Not for psychiatric evaluations. The rotors didn't cut. They spooled down, slowly, deliberately, rotors still spinning as the rear ramp lowered with a hydraulic hiss. Through the windows, Danielle watched 2 figures emerge into the dawn light. Both wore dress blues. Both moved with the efficiency of men who'd spent their lives answering to things that didn't require explanation. They walked toward the ER entrance. The intake nurse stood. Other staff appeared in doorways, nurses and medics drawn by the sound of military hardware where there should have been silence. The young Marines in the waiting room exchanged looks. One of them whispered something. The other nodded. The doors to the ER swung open. 2 Marines in dress uniforms entered the waiting room, their presence immediately rearranging the air pressure in the space. Not tall. Not exceptionally built. But moving with a kind of controlled violence that came from deployments where mistakes cost lives. One was black, built like a construction project, with the calm eyes of someone who'd already survived worse. The other was smaller, wiry, with the kind of scar tissue that meant he'd fought for a living. They walked directly to the intake desk. Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross, the larger Marine said. Not a question. A call sign. "We're looking for Reaper 6. The intake nurse blinked. She's in the waiting room. Right there." They turned. Both of them. Eyes finding her with the precision of weapons systems locking onto target. Danielle didn't flinch. She'd been trained not to flinch. She'd been trained not to do a lot of things. The Marines walked toward her. But they didn't reach her. The doorway to the ER erupted with another uniform, this one a captain's rank, this one moving with the kind of authority that made everyone in the waiting room stop breathing. Commander Marcus Price, still favoring his left leg slightly but walking on it, standing on the leg Danielle had saved 72 hours ago by making an incision that ended her career. His face was harder than she remembered. Time and blood and surgery had carved it into something that looked like judgment. "Her real name is Danielle Ross." His voice carried across the waiting room like a command, like something that didn't require agreement to be true. "Senior Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy SEALs. Not just a nurse. Not just a contractor. Not someone you fire because her competence made you afraid." A chart hit the floor. The intake nurse had dropped it. Behind Price, two more figures emerged. One was the hospital chaplain, Father Mendez, a former Army medic who'd stayed quiet through all of Whitfield's humiliation, who'd watched the note appear in Danielle's locker and said nothing. He was holding a folder now, manila and official, his collar white against his dark skin. The other figure was someone Danielle didn't recognize, a woman in a Navy dress uniform, bars on her shoulder indicating senior officer, her face set into the expression of someone who'd come to settle accounts. Father Mendez stepped forward. His voice was steady, the voice of a man who'd prayed over the dying and learned to speak their names with reverence. 3 tours in Fallujah. Embedded with SEAL Team 3 as their lead combat medic. Credited with 47 lives saved under direct fire. 2 of those lives were command personnel who would have bled out in the streets without her expertise. He read from the file like he was reading the names of the dead, which, in a way, he was. The names of people who would have been dead if Danielle Ross hadn't existed. 47. One of the young Marines in the waiting room stood up. Then another. Then the woman with the sling. One by one, every military person in that waiting room came to their feet. Not at attention. Just standing. Witnessing. The television in the corner was still on, showing morning news with the sound muted. The image changed. A naval dress uniform appeared on screen. An admiral's uniform, the kind of rank that didn't usually interrupt regular programming. An admiral's face, serious and measured, began moving behind a podium. Someone found the remote. The volume came up. Confirming commendation ceremony scheduled for the East Room of the White House. Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross is being awarded 2 Bronze Stars with Valor for actions in Fallujah, 2005 through 2007. A Silver Star for commanding decisions under fire. And as of this moment, the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for extraordinary heroism demonstrated both in active combat and in civilian medical emergency as recently as 72 hours ago. The Admiral paused. His eyes found the camera like he was looking directly at someone specific. The Navy and Marine Corps Medal recognizes extraordinary heroism not in combat but in saving lives at imminent personal risk. It recognizes someone who chooses to act when institutional cowardice says to wait. It recognizes someone who chose a patient over protocol, valor over obedience, and in doing so, saved the leg and life of Commander Marcus Price, the same officer whose life she saved in Fallujah 18 years ago. The Admiral paused again. That same officer's commanding officer then was the person responsible for Senior Chief Ross's discharge. And 1 day ago, that person attempted to have her removed from the profession of nursing based on fabricated psychological concerns, moments after she performed an emergency fasciotomy to save a patient's limb. The waiting room had gone so quiet you could hear the ventilation system's mechanical breath. Then a phone rang. A cell phone with the particular ringtone of an institutional line. One of the officers answered it, listened for 3 seconds, then handed it to the Admiral's image on the television. The Admiral spoke to someone off camera. The camera cut away briefly to what looked like a parking lot, Riverside Community Hospital parking lot, and then cut back to the Admiral. His expression had changed. I am now being informed that Dr. Robert Whitfield, Emergency Department Director at Riverside Community Hospital, is currently attempting to discredit Senior Chief Petty Officer Ross as a mentally unstable former military personnel on a public call with the State Medical Board. The Admiral's voice had the particular quality of someone who was about to destroy a career in real time. Doctor, you just ended your own future on live television, watched by approximately 3 million people. You fired one of the most decorated medical personnel in naval special warfare history because she was more competent than you. You attempted to have her institutionalized because she exposed your incompetence. And you did it all on the record. The Admiral turned to address someone off-screen. I want every communication Dr. Whitfield sent to that medical board. I want his medical history. I want his prescription records. I want to know what he's been medicating himself for, because what I just witnessed was a man in professional crisis attempting to destroy a subordinate. The television feed cut. Just cut. Like someone had killed the broadcast mid-sentence. The ER erupted. A nurse Danielle recognized from Riverside, Marcus Chen, a good medic who'd refused to participate in Whitfield's reassignment, stood up in his seat in the waiting room. You fired her. His voice cracked. You told her she was insubordinate? You called her what? I watched you in that elevator. I saw exactly what you did. Another nurse appeared in the doorway to the ER itself. Then another. Then one of the interns who'd filmed the staff meeting on her phone. Within 90 seconds, there were 8 Riverside staff members in that waiting room, and the air had changed. It had the quality of a crowd that had just realized it had been lied to, manipulated, compromised. The quality of institutional shame. Commander Price moved to stand beside Danielle's chair. Not touching her. Just standing. Bearing witness. Father Mendez did the same from her other side. The 2 Marines took positions at the waiting room entrance, not blocking anyone, just making clear that what happened next was official. The hospital phone rang. Then rang again. Then started ringing continuously. An administrator somewhere was making calls. Decisions were being made in rooms she couldn't see, by people she'd never met, in response to something that had gone national. Institutional machinery was grinding itself into motion to correct what it had allowed to happen. Within 20 minutes, the Jacksonville VA hospital CEO appeared in the waiting room, still holding his phone to his ear, face pale. He looked at Danielle. Then at Commander Price standing beside her. Then at the Marines. Then at the Admiral still on the television screen, the broadcast having restarted with updates rolling across the bottom of the screen. He hung up the phone. His expression said everything about what he'd just heard. Senior Chief Ross, the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, will be handling the investigation into Dr. Whitfield's conduct. The State Medical Board is freezing his license pending review. And I need to tell you. He paused, looking at the assembled military officers. I need to tell you I'm sorry. We failed you. The system failed you. Danielle didn't respond. She didn't need to. Reaper 6 was already awake. And the world was about to learn exactly who they'd been firing. Like and subscribe if you believe nurses deserve more respect. And tell me honestly, what would you have done in her shoes? I'm pinning the best answer.